Hello. For this section, I want to be talking to you over these next few videos about the Episcopal Church in the post-World War II context, with a specific focus on the question of civil rights. In that context, though, I think it's important for us to think about how issues of the Anglican Communion itself are pressing upon the Episcopal Church in the immediate post-war period. And so I want to think a little bit about post-colonialism and the development of a global communion to start things off. There's a couple of factors at play here. One is the rise of Western secularism in the mid-20th century, which leads to a question of what is the place of the church in society. And what happens in the Church of England is that there's a sense within the church that it needs to turn away from a sense of a union between church and state in this establishment model to creating alternate structures that articulate the Catholicity of the church. This is going to go a long ways towards the refinement of the structures of the Anglican Communion proper in the 1940s through 70s. William Temple, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury during World War II, argues that one of the things we need to see is that the standards of worldly society ultimately have failed Christianity. The rise of totalitarianism, whether communism or Nazism, economic depression, ongoing strife between races, all show the failure of worldly standards. And so the church has to embrace its Catholic vision and its apostolic nature to create this alternative order. And this then is also what's going to propel this shift towards embracing ancient liturgical patterns as a way of creating this alternate social identity. So the liturgical renewal movement is about a turning away from secular standards of what is of most value. And so liturgy then emerges as a high marker of distinctiveness for Christians in secular society, and that's why the Eucharist is pushed towards the center of this. I think this really helps you understand the energy around the liturgical renewal movement in the 1950s to 1970s in the Episcopal Church. Another key dynamic here is the emergence of a post-colonial church. The British Empire really unravels after World War II. India, East Africa, West Africa, on and on through the Caribbean, all these former British colonial holdings are released into independence. And this means that new independent provinces of the communion also have to emerge. And this is one of the most significant factors in the creation of what we see as the Anglican Communion itself. The Anglican Communion is the emergence or an articulation of a post-colonial reality. Other factors at play here is the rise of both the United States and the Soviet Union as rival global powers, which means the Episcopal Church emerges as a rival center of influence among Anglican churches around the globe. So the Church of England is no longer the only center point. There's now really two poles between the Episcopal Church and the Church of England. And so then there is a reframing of identity and structures away from thinking about empire and mission as part of what drives Christian expansion or Anglican expansion to thinking more about collaborative and networked identities. So if we're going to see the birth of global Anglicanism really coming into its own, say, by the 1950s, and certainly by the 1960s, then we also need to think about emerging models of leadership. So often in places that have become newly independent from the British Empire, the elites in these independent nations are often Anglican because they've been attending Anglican church schools. And Anglicanism is then often at the center of educating people, even in a post-colonial context, and helping to push towards questions about how does one indigenize Christianity in newly independent contexts. And so, in many parts where there's a newly independent nation that had been formerly British or under British control, and that still retains an Anglicanism as part of its local Christian identity, anti-imperialism is not always anti-Christian. So in places in West Africa like Ghana and Nigeria, Christian identity that has indigenized itself often goes hand in hand with an independence movement. This is not always the case. Kenya is a really strong counterexample to this. But we need to be aware that there's lots of complexity and nuance in reading about post-colonial traditions and post-colonial nations vis-a-vis Anglicanism. This also requires Anglicanism as a whole to come to terms with racism. If there is a decolonization process, and by decolonization, I mean a whole process by which the operative assumptions of empire are stripped out of the mentality and structures of a newly independent nation. We're seeing here Anglican leaders taking stances against remaining British settler classes that want to retain racist, imperial, colonialist attitudes. A primary place for seeing this is in South Africa, where, as you know well, there is an apartheid system established there through the Dutch Boer government that is reinforced in significant ways by the attitudes of some racist people of English or British descent. However, there is significant resistance to apartheid by British Anglican priests, most notably Trevor Huddleston and John Collins, who worked strenuously against apartheid laws that were passed in a post-World War II context. Notably, the 1958 Lambeth Conference composes a letter supporting the anti-apartheid movement, that is, saying that Anglicanism is opposed to state oppression and racist discrimination. And this letter also articulates an opposition against segregation in the United States and the support of integration movements. This is going to come to have quite a deal of relevance as we look at the Episcopal Church in race in a little bit. Note also that Desmond Tutu, in his work as the Archbishop of Cape Town, articulates his resistance to apartheid as a path of reconciliation that's informed by Anglican values. He draws on the writings of Charles Gore, his influence by Gore and Temple in particular, and then brings in his own understanding of Ubuntu from his own specific context to fuse an indigenized South African Anglican theological spiritual resistance to apartheid. And so this decolonization process then begins to move throughout all the provinces of the Communion. So you would have had previously a diocese in Ghana or in Singapore or India that was under the Archbishop of Canterbury. These all now become dioceses that devolve into new independent processes. Geoffrey Fisher, Archbishop of Canterbury, from 1945 to 1961, is especially active in the creation of independent provinces in the continent of Africa. This then requires giving newfound authority to indigenous leaders and ending the presence of white bishops. Frankly, there's sometimes a lag time here between the creation of independent provinces and the elevation of indigenous leaders. But usually within a decade, that transition is accomplished. Decolonization, though, is also an event within Britain. That is, removing imperial colonialist lenses also has to happen at the center of the empire. There's broad cultural, social, and economic changes that are occurring in Great Britain as a result of immigration from former parts of the empire, whether it is the Windrush generation coming out of the Caribbean, people from Pakistan or India arriving as migrants after the upheaval of partition, or migration from various areas of Africa, in particular places like Nigeria. This is going to require the Church of England eventually to ask, is the Church of England in England a church of simply the ethnic inhabitants of England, as people descend from Normans and Anglo-Saxons and what have you? Or is it a church of all people and is going to welcome Anglicans from across the communion where they find a home here now? This gives you a lot to think about. I want this to be a context for us to think about how the question about civil rights, integration, is maybe also a question about decolonization. We're going to get to that in the next video. I hope this has provided some food for thought for you.